In today's video, I want to teach you how to learn how to paint and train values using specific strategies in order to have an easier starting point for painting. So please enjoy the video. In these days where we have so many possibilities of using different mediums, it can become relatively overwhelming to decide what to start with. In today's demo, I will use ink by Pilot. So this one here. I will also approximately using a pencil, maybe also a pen, an ink pen, depending on how I feel. And we will approximately also use watercolor for today's demo, but mostly the black one. Everything I will show you today, you can also acquire while using either Copic markers, charcoal, pencil, gouache, or even oil paints. The premise is that you have the possibility to build up a tonal scale. I never received traditional education in how to paint, and I learned painting values mostly through Copic marker sketches, while I was also working through the How to Render book by Scott Robertson. And I mostly focus on painting digital because the work required that. If your goal is to work in the entertainment industry, and if you are keen to work in a digital format, I highly recommend starting with this as soon as possible. And not only working through the book, but also painting digital in general, because you just have to get used to it. Since the feeling of traditional to digital is always a bit different. But generally speaking, I believe that the better you get with traditional, the better you also get with digital. When we start with our art journey, we often begin with the path of pencil. This will lead us eventually to the point of shading. And here's just a little explanation of the most important things you need to remember when it comes to shading in general. I call it the big 7. We have the light side and the midtones, the highlight, the terminator, which basically shows when light gets terminated and it turns into shadow. Then we have the core shadow, which is basically the darkest part of this shadow. We have the bounce light. We have the ambient occlusion shadow, which is basically when two objects touching each other, they basically create a very dark contact shadow, or some people also call it contact shadow. And last but not least, we also have the cast shadow. And on the left, you can see a more simpler concept of what are we explaining on the right, while only using volume lines. Shading or rendering are describing the communication of volume through using tone. Masters like Mobius, who only used line work, were able to communicate form through only using volume lines, overlaps, or darker lines and line weight. So that is basically a more simpler way of communicating the change of volume. And this will be our first strategy today. We will only use the white of the paper as light and the black from our ink as a shadow. For our first strategy, we can only use an ink pen, or we also use directly ink. We can also use watercolor. You can also do a preparation drawing with pencils, also totally fine. And let's do that for the sake of demonstration. First strategy number 1. So first thing we do is we only use two things. We use the white of the paper as light. And of course, we're going to use black for the shadows. So only two things. First, I want you to choose a subject. Please start simple. Take simple objects that you can have. You can even draw this. You can also look for still life references on Pinterest. Take in the beginning simple subjects to make this step way easier. And I also will do it simple in the beginning to showcase what I mean by this. So first we start looking closely to see where light and shadow is separating, and this is very important. And this separation is really important because it helps to communicate realism of the light and the volume. But it also gives us an easier take to see shapes that we are creating. So let's quickly draw something. So I'm drawing a sphere sitting on a box that's sitting on another box. Okay? So first we need to determine where the light source is coming from. And let's say the light source is coming from this side. Again, we start by looking closely where the light is and where the shadow is falling. So we need to look what is the angle of the light to figure out what would be the shadow. So let's start with the sphere. Obviously the cast shadow is round because the surface is round. And then also we're going to have where our core shadow terminator sits. Going to have the shadow side of that. And then also this whole side of the box will be in shadow, and it will also cast a shadow on the other box. And also this side here will completely be in shadow. And we're also going to have a cast shadow from here to here. Now we'll just simplify that so to not make it too complicated. It's going to be a very long cast shadow. This separation is really important because it helps to communicate realism of your light and volume, but it also gives us an easier take to see how and what shapes we are creating. Creating shapes in painting is really important. And I mean, it's really important. But whenever we start rendering anything, we always want to focus on form first. And second are shapes. Why? Because our first job is to communicate light and shadow. So this helps us for realism. The shapes are there for beautification. Okay? Really important. Some of the old institutions are still using shapes and angles also to teach drawing techniques, especially when it comes to simplification. But that's a topic for another video. When we create our shadow shapes or shapes in general, the important part is to always keep in mind that we do not want to create wet noodles. So we rather want to create a very clear shape rather than something unclear. Because if we would go out and ask 100 people which shape they would prefer, they probably would go for this one because it has a lot of clarity, straight line and a C-curve. But this one here has a lot of unclarity. So that's why I call this the wet noodle. And we do not want this. Always shoot for clarity in your shapes. Make clear decisions. In our first strategy, we focus on drawing the elements while observing the perspective and the volume of the objects. So we basically checking where the light is coming from in order to determine the angle of the shadows. We have two options. We can draw in volume lines, or we basically darken this whole thing, right? So again, to the example of, we could say we draw this thing and we just add volume lines to communicate this, or we completely darken and blacken out the shadows. We have two options. We can draw in the volume lines, which I recommend if you only have an ink pen and your sketchbook and you're running around, and if you want to try also to draw like Mobius. But the other option is basically to darken overlaps and the ambient occlusion shadows. Basically, we completely darken and blacken the cast shadows. So your homework will be to do this at least 5 to 7 times. You do not need to do this on a big scale, so you can see this is relatively small. In fact, getting used to this in a smaller format, such as a thumbnail sketch, will also teach you the planning aspect of your own future images. So please start with simple subjects, such as geometric subjects or still life studies. You can always go on Pinterest, type in geometric objects, you can type in still life studies. You will always find good reference images there. When you've done your homework and you did a lot of more easier subjects, you can also slowly go into more difficult subjects, of course, where you can also end up trying this on figure drawings. And I just wanted to show this as a quick example, where I basically combined both of the first strategy, where I used volume lines to communicate things such as folds, but I also decided to darken certain areas in order to communicate shadows. And as we know, whenever we try to paint a figure, usually they are relatively lit from both sides, which means we have light sources coming from both sides. So it's technically like if we would paint or if we would render a big cylinder which has a giant core shadow in the middle. You have a lot of options when you try to use the first strategy. And I feel the strategy is also very strong because you have a lot of freedom in it. So it has only to do with your decision making. So please do me really a favor, really try this out first before you jump into complete tonal scales. So we mastered the first important tones in our scale, which is black and also white. When I learned how to make scales for myself, I learned that black is a 0 on a scale, so number 0, and white is 100. Also, in general, regarding to numbers, I know there are different concepts, but I will use this range from 0 to 100. Not 0 to 10, because I want to keep it aligned with digital painting, where you have the same type of slider in Photoshop or in any other digital painting program. When I teach my one-on-one classes, I also refer that in digital painting, we never want to go full black, because that is basically the darkest dark, and we refer with completely absence of light, which we only have in space. But in this case, since we use this as a full black, that is okay to use. So adding tones to a painting can become very messy sometimes. And that's why we need to fully understand what is happening when light hits an object. And it has a reason why this got taught over 100 years of academic institutions to learn how to shade with either a pencil or chalk or any other mediums that go hand in hand with subtracting tone, right? Because that is the power and that's the freedom of it. Having a medium that allows you to subtract tone is always easier. But it's of course not impossible with watercolor, because watercolor requires the planning of what to keep blank, so the white as the light, and also a bit more carefulness and discipline. Now let's build up the scale. Your next task is to figure out how to get a medium gray with the medium you are using at the moment. So for me, this will be ink, and I will actually show you how I do this. And this here will also be a really good helpful friend. So if I dip in the pen, if I dip in the brush, you can see that this is pure black, right? So what I want to do, so we're starting here, right? Pure black. So what I need to do is I need to water it down. So I go in once, tap it, go on the side, and see how bright it becomes. Now I can also go again on my testing sheet, and I would always recommend having a testing sheet with you. Now I see it's relatively darker, but it's not as dark as I want it. So all I do, I go in again, take another spot, water it down, dip it also once that I have the control of the ink flow. And this comes relatively close to a medium gray. And if I want to complete my scale, I can do that again, of course. And I would also recommend you to do that as well, because that is the first step in using any medium that you can technically water down or basically reduce the darkness while adding water, because that is what you need to get used to. And I can do that multiple times. And here I just need to make sure, because the water is not drying so fast. But you see it gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and I can just repeat that multiple times until I have it really watered down. So I'm basically reducing the amount of pixels in here, of pigment, sorry, not pixels, pigment. Let's just push it further until I have literally nothing in here anymore. You see, like this is getting super, super bright. And where we want to reach is obviously our white, our 100, right? We want to have the pure white. And this is the first step that you need to master with your medium, is to basically be able, so here's our pure white, is to be able to build the scale. Okay? But you don't need to paint with it right away, because for the next step, we only want to use this, the 50, okay? The medium gray. So since we use the ink now and water it down, we now created lighter tones. This part of painting requires time and experience. So that's why it's important to paint every day. Yes, you heard me, every day. But it can be as little as any subject to communicate form. Here are just some examples. Whenever I have time and I have either way my sketchbook or I use these bigger formats, I give myself 30 to 60 minutes and I try not to spend more time than this. I mostly either way experiment, trying to build up the scale and to execute the painting. Again, I do not spend more than 30 to 60 minutes to keep the practice efficient. As a growing artist and somebody who wants to do this for the rest of your life, you want to build up a habit of creating every day with having zero expectations. That will guarantee that you will continue, learn from your mistakes, and that you can also celebrate the little wins in your artwork. So go ahead now, try to build up a scale of tones. There's also something important I want to mention when it comes to tone strategy, because there are multiple. When I started my career in industrial design and I learned to render with Copic markers, the first thing I've learned was the strategy of odd and even numbers. So whenever you want to use Copic markers, you would buy, they're also very pricey, you would buy specific ones. So warm, cool, neutral, and you would basically choose either way odd numbers or even numbers. Because when you have even numbers like 40, 60 and 80, it's easier to build up a good tonal shift in your painting or in your Copic rendering. Same goes for odd numbers if you would choose 30, 50 and 70. When rendering a subject with 3 tones, right, so 1, 2 and 3, it becomes more important to understand the principle of local value. In painting, local value means the natural lightness or darkness of a color on an object before light and shadow changes. Okay, so basically imagine the object without any light or any shadow hitting it. So when artists talk about tone, they usually mean how light or dark something looks overall, and that includes shadows and highlights. Local value is the object's basic light or dark level. So a lemon, for example, has a relatively light local value. A dark t-shirt has a relatively dark local value right from the get-go. So both of these objects, before they got hit by light, they are either way relatively bright or either way relatively dark. When artists talk about tone, they usually mean how light or dark something looks overall, but it includes light and shadow. Just to make sure that you understand, the local value describes the object's basic light and dark level. Okay, so how dark is basically the built-in value. And when we talk about tone, we are talking about how this value changes with the lighting. Okay, so I hope that you understand this, because this part is really important to understand the next step. Now that we figured that out, for us that means that we need to add another planning aspect into our painting before we add the tone and values. We need to decide what is the local value of the object or the material we want to paint. So let's try to paint her as an example. So figuring out what the local value is, we first need to put this in our planning, which means we need to decide what's going to be the local value. And I really like this example here because I feel it's relatively clear. We have the very bright skin tone, we have the very bright shirt, and we have also the very dark leather, which offers a lot of contrast with these reflections. Okay, so my plan is that I first want to keep the face, so the skin, and also the shirt white. So I'm going to use the white of the paper. And for the rest, I will add a relatively medium dark tone in the beginning. So let's do that. First, I start with the basic drawing. Since I want to be fast, I skip the pencil stage, but if you're a beginner, I always recommend to make a pencil drawing to construct the proper form in the beginning. Please do not make the mistake of thinking you also need to do it, like me, directly with the brush. This takes a lot of time in order to get a relatively good result that you like. First, we start with the basic drawing, and I start with the face. I focus first on the outlines and the volume lines as we discussed it in the first strategy, because I, of course, also want to build up the form. And as I mentioned, form is the most important in the beginning. While I build up the form, I also want to keep in mind what are the shapes. So what are the things I'm looking for? So the strategy is, of course, to use the white of the paper as the local value of the skin. I love to do that because it creates a great contrast whenever I add dark hair, for example. But more important, it is super easy to control. In later stages, I can also add any lighter tone if I want to describe any shadows or extra volume in the skin. I decided that I want to have two focal points on this figure, which is one, the face and the hair, so the contrast of the relatively bright skin of the face and the dark hair, but also the leather boots, because they're relatively close to the camera. When rendering shiny materials, especially with ink, we need to be even more careful in the planning, because we need these little extra light shapes in the area to keep them blank. I gave the skirt and the boots a similar dark value, and by adding more darkness later, I can bring out the bright areas on the boots to create this strong contrast. So I'm constantly thinking about the scale that I'm using. And keep in mind, whenever you put the brightest on the scale next to the darkest on the scale, you create the most contrast. So choose very wise where to place that. Also, when using a brush, I would always recommend to add the tone relatively even. So try not to use too many brush marks, because it could create a relatively messy outcome and create a lot of extra texture, unless that's what you're aiming for. So go ahead now, but start simple again. After everything dried, attack the shadows as we did it in the first approach with only white and black. Look for the angles and figure out what are the shapes that we want to create. Important, try to paint in your shadows with consistency, means use only one consistent tone to paint in the shadows. If you start to mix your shadow tone in the beginning too much, it becomes very messy and it feels more like sculpting in tones. Unless it is something that you want to try, and this is an example of this. It's not impossible to fix, but it will lower the outcome of the quality and might also mess up the value separation. The more values you add, the higher the chance to create a big mess. So please only start with 3 values. Rather start slow and try not to bite off more than you can chew. Try to paint more complex subjects every day. And over time, slowly add more tones to the subject. Give yourself time to grow. The power of doing this strategy every day is to learn the difference in materials and how they react to similar light conditions. And will make sure your color image will have strong value structures. When you start to create your own images, make sure to set the contrast to the areas you want the people to look at and give surrounding less information and less contrast. This will create a visual hierarchy in order to lead the eye through the image. So go ahead now, build your own scales, learn how to mix the values and start with only 3 tones. Did you learn something today? If you want to learn more with me in one-on-one private lessons, check out my mentorship, link is below. Feel free to like and subscribe. I appreciate you all and see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.